Hey everyone, it's Argonath here from The Right Way, and I came across some articles about what's happening in Melbourne City and the state of Victoria, where the Premier of the state is making a power grab to get more powers for himself, and there's been some quite big protests against this, which is happening. So let's have a look at kind of in general what's happening with the laws that are going to be introduced. So draconian government introduces new pandemic laws into Parliament. So one of the things is that people found guilty of intentionally and recklessly breaching public health orders would face 2 years jail or a $90,000 fine. Now, I wonder if that could be up to 2 years jail and up to $90,000 fine. I mean, surely it wouldn't be exactly 2 years jail for anything which matches that. There must be some granularity there, but I'm not sure. It doesn't really say. The Premier will get sweeping powers to declare pandemics, and the public's right to privacy will be enshrined in law under pandemic legislation introduced by the Andrews government. So I'm quite happy about having the right to privacy be enshrined. I'm in New Zealand, so we don't have anything like that over here. So that would be good for them. But the other parts of the bill that Andrews is trying to push through is not so good. The opposition labelled the Public Health and Wellbeing Amendment draconian, while civil liberty groups welcomed the stronger safeguards for QR check-in data. The new pandemic-specific laws will replace state of emergency powers when they expire on December 15, curtail the Chief Health Officer's powers, giving the Premier authority to declare a pandemic, and the Health Minister the role of making public health orders. Premier Andrews said the new legislation was informed by similar laws in other states and overseas, will provide greater degree of transparency, accountability and oversight. Ultimately, the bill goes further than the New South Wales model, New Zealand model, and even beyond that, with the scrutiny of acts and regulations, blah, blah, blah. So, apparently this has been based on the New Zealand model, where basically the Prime Minister, because New Zealand doesn't have states, we're just one big country, we all have the same basically rules. We do have kind of local body rules, but they are just for very minor things, not for things where it's health related and so on. And basically our Prime Minister makes the rules for the whole country. The Health Minister makes the public health orders with the bureaucrats from the Ministry of Health, and basically there's no kind of independent committee which has any other input other than people from the Ministry of Health and their so-called health experts. So we don't have things like economists being in the conversation. We don't have things like business people being in the conversation. So basically, New Zealand has been trashing all of our small businesses because they haven't been able to operate in lockdowns and so on, especially in Auckland, which has been locked down the most, almost 3 months now, where businesses can't operate. Only just recently they've been able to start operating again. And obviously a lot of these small businesses are going to the wall because the government only listens to advice from the public health experts, who always go into saying, hey, we need to lock down, we need to lock down, we need to lock down. And so obviously the Victorian Premier is doing the same basic thing. So yeah, I really do. So a pandemic can initially be declared for 4 weeks and renewed in 3-month intervals thereafter until the disease no longer presents a risk to the community. So basically the Premier is the one that can decide this. He can take advice from other people, but ultimately it's his decision, and if he decides to ignore the advice, he can actually do that. There's no kind of vote that would go on in Parliament, just like there is no vote in New Zealand either. Although in New Zealand the government has an absolute majority, so it wouldn't make any difference if there was a vote anyway. So I think people are really dead set against this, because once you start little bits of your liberty slipping, it's going to lead to a much more slippery slope, and eventually you can find that you're living under a draconian totalitarian regime, which is what it's looking like for both New Zealand and Victoria. So a lot of the actual media are not really going into the details about this. They're not showing how dissatisfied people are about this. There's been huge protests out there, and they're trying to frame the protests as anti-vax protests, which is exactly what's happening in New Zealand as well. Because any protest we have, all of the media, the left-wing liberal media, which are tied to the government, they're always going on about how the protest involves anti-vaxxers, but in fact they never actually talk up about how this is a freedom protest, not an anti-vax protest. They always bring up the anti-vax angle because they know that it will turn people off, and they can distract from what people are actually protesting about. So we've got a video here from skynews.com.au, who is one of the more sort of centre-right media news organisations out there, and I highly suggest you watch some of their stuff on YouTube and so on. So let's have a listen.
But first, Saturday afternoon's protest against Daniel Andrews' proposed new pandemic laws was one of the largest crowds I've seen in any Australian city on any political issue. People from all walks of life, young, old, male, female, inner city residents and families from the suburbs and regional Victoria. People of all political affiliations, but united in their opposition to a set of laws that they argue are unjust.
And that's what we find in New Zealand exactly as well. A lot of the freedom protests, which the media describe as anti-vax protests, but they're not. All people from all different walks of life, all different ethnicities. We've got Māori people, Pacific Island people, white people, Asian people, whoever it happens to be, young and old people. We've got left-wingers, we've got right-wingers. They're all fighting for the same thing, which is freedom.
Ordinary Victorians, many of them have never said they'd protested before, but have said to me over and over again that these laws were a tipping point for them and that they couldn't stay silent any longer. Now, I know that to be true because I was there. I was there because I wanted to see and hear from these Victorians firsthand, to be able to tell you tonight of what I saw and what these Victorians told me. Like you, I've watched these protests for many months now, and like you, I've watched how they've been reported by many in the media. Cranks, rent-a-crowd activists, anti-vaxxers. You've heard it too, I'm sure.
Yep, that's exactly what's happening in New Zealand. On the 6 o'clock news, when there's a protest on, they're always going on about, oh, these are all crackpots, they're anti-vaxxers, all that kind of thing. In the print media, all of these lefty media organisations, they're all the same, right? They always want to deflect from the real issue.
But as I walked into Spring Street on Saturday, it wasn't what I saw. I saw a lot of people like you and me, walking peacefully with their placards, their Australian flags, parents with prams, elderly Victorians, not the usual activist crowd. And if you look at the numbers, that in itself tells you this was a huge groundswell of citizens who said enough is enough. And if not me, then who'll stand up against this pandemic bill tyranny? Some in the media put the crowd at 10 to 15,000. Now, clearly, they can't count.
Yep, and we get the same thing in New Zealand as well, right? We get these protests come out and they always downplay the numbers, right? I mean, all numbers are estimates, but they always make it a really low estimate because they don't want other people to notice how much discontent there is out there.
Have a look yourself at this footage of the crowd massed at the steps of the Victorian Parliament, all the way along out there on Spring Street, stretching down Burke Street towards the Burke Street Mall.
So there's
better estimates put the crowd at
So there's crowd going off to the left, there's crowd going off to the right as well, and then all the crowd coming back out this way.
well over 60,000 people, some as high as 100,000. The fact that these weren't bust-in activists or the usual trades hall union crowd shows just how deeply Victorians have been.
Right, that is a huge amount of people, right? There's definitely not just 5 or 10,000 people. Might not be 60,000, but it'll be pretty close, getting pretty close to that. Again, they're always downplaying the numbers. The media are absolute trash, the mainstream media. And Australia are very lucky that they have skynews.com.au, because it speaks the truth. It's more of a right-wing media organisation. I just wish we had something like this in New Zealand.
Been impacted by this pandemic and their desire to rein in their Premier's power, not give him any more. To me, it was the moment, really, when Melbourne got some of its self-respect back. Honestly, after the humiliation of going from the world's most livable city to the world's most locked down.
Oh, yep, that's what's that happened in Auckland as well, although it's never been the most livable city. But yeah, we can see these things are being paralleled in Australia and New Zealand. People are becoming much more discontent in New Zealand, although the media in New Zealand are still trying to push out the fear porn. They're still trying to scare people into submission and get them to do what the government wants. But we just need to wait and see what's going to happen. Anyway, I thought this was a really interesting article about what's happening in Australia, and it's a very scary thought to think that this might happen in New Zealand or other countries as well. Anyway, let me know what you think. Whatever country, are you finding your media, mainstream media, are also downplaying the discontent of the people, trying to distract people from the real thing that the governments are doing? Love to hear your comments. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't like the video, you're welcome to give it a thumbs down, and hopefully I will catch you in the next video.